Good morning, everyone. We're at 9:45, a little after that, and I'm sure we'll have some more people trickle in, but I wanted to go ahead and get started. It's good to see you all, and thanks for joining me today for Sunday Forum. This Lent, we're doing sort of a series in Sunday Forum that complements the preaching series on a Sunday morning by finding connections between the people or the subjects and themes that we're preaching on and what we're talking about in Sunday Forum. So trying to remember, what was that first Sunday? Oh, first Sunday was Samuel and that calling to find a king for God's people, even though he didn't really want to. So Pastor Lori taught about the different governmental structures that the ancient Israelites saw today on that Sunday. Today is Esau, and I preached on his vocation of forgiveness this morning. But I also mentioned, and we sang a lot of hymns that acknowledge that Esau is the father to his own nation. And it speaks, like when we say that, Esau is the father of the Edomites. There's that word, Edomites, for a group of people. And I feel like I have just like this category in my brain of all the different tribes and right? That look exactly, Gail. It's like, how can we possibly keep track of all this? And so that's what today is about. It might get a little technical in some places, but the goal is to help you sort of walk away with a better understanding of who did God's people live among and what their relationship was about. So I mentioned that today's sermon focuses on Esau, and who, like his brother Jacob, became a father to a nation, the Edomites. And throughout the Hebrew Bible, there are lots of different peoples, nations, tribes. Sometimes it's hard to just keep track of them all. Now, what's really, really interesting and perhaps helpful for us is that God's people, the Israelites, really, really saw a connection. They had a worldview where these things were all sort of intertwined, where identity, genealogy, geography, and history, they were all the same things. They were all sort of wrapped up in the same way. And so what we have in the story of God's people is these branches, quite literally in a family tree that branches off, and we get nations and peoples and tribes that descend from this, and acknowledges the places where they occupy, especially highlighted in those portions of the Bible where God's people are coming into the land, they're settling the land, they are conquering the land, and we'll look a little bit more into that. Today, what we're not going to do, generally speaking, is focus on the historical or the archaeological evidence. But rather, we're going to focus on the story of the Bible and the worldview of God's people as witnessed through the Bible. And that means that there's some complexities. There's some hard things we have to sort of tease apart. One of the things is that God's people often recall the stories of these times, of the tribal lands and tribal relationships, living among Gentiles, during a time that was long after those events occurred. So the collective memory, they might have remembered details slightly incorrectly, and we'll look at some cases, like, does this tribe belong to these people or to those people, or maybe these two different tribes are actually one, They're recalling the details from way, way beyond when these events were happening. God's people also told stories about other people, the history and the genealogies within their worldview. They told stories in ways that maybe the Edomites wouldn't claim, or the Moabites would say, no, that's not our history, that's not our lineage. So it's important to remember that the stories we hear are from God's people's perspectives, and not necessarily the same heritage and stories and history and genealogy that those own people would claim. You'll see in a few places where some of God's enemies, the enemies of God's people, get a bad rap in the genealogy or the history of the story. So there's three primary ways that we are going to look at all of this today. We're going to look at the genealogies, because the Bible's full of them. We're also going to look at the geography, kind of like, where were these people? And then we're also going to look at the relationship between God's people and these Gentile neighbors. And specifically, we're going to ask the question, what was the relationship God wanted God's people to have with Gentiles? And in the reality, what was it really like, right? Like God may cast the vision for it, but what was it really like? And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, is what does Jesus teach us about these kinds of relationships? And maybe gives us a little insight for how we can move forward and not just reflect on history or something that happened a long time ago. So first, genealogy. Look at this. All in one chart of the genealogy of Jesus, right? Tons of people have done charts like this. But our exercise today is a little bit different. We're looking at the descendants through God's family tree of nations and peoples and tribes. But you can find these connections here in the lineage of Jesus. And in fact, we'll take it all the way through Jesus today. But when we sort of start out here and looking at the genealogy, the family tree of God's people, of course, starts with Adam and Eve. They had their eldest son, Cain, right? You might remember, killed his brother. Another sibling rivalry going on in this family. So Cain kills Abel, and afterwards he flees for his life. He flees east of Eden to a place called the land of Nod, which is this sort of it's out there. It's east of Eden. It might sort of correspond with modern day Azerbaijan. It's sort of thought of maybe in the Caucasus. And because of Cain's story, the land of Nod has sort of became associated with violence, wanderers, exiles, that kind of thing. But it really isn't referred to all that much in the Bible. It's just kind of like, and Cain went out there, and that's sort of it. What's interesting is in the modern sense, the land of Nod has become this sort of fairy tale story of the place where we go to dream, which is so different from the biblical origin of the story. But really, by and large, most of that sort of early genealogy doesn't matter so much because the flood is kind of like a great pruning of the family tree, right? The vision, of course, is that only Noah and his sons survived the flood, and so Noah descends through Seth, the youngest son of Adam and Eve. Now, after the flood, there is sort of this general idea. I struggled to find a map that I think really actually reflected a way. Saying that Japheth went to Europe is not accurate, because plenty of Japheth's tribe settles in Turkey and other places. But in general, we could think about Shem and his descendants sort of went towards Asia. Ham sort of went towards Africa. And in general, Japheth went north towards Europe. But this is just sort of a very generic way. It's interesting when you see medieval maps of the world, they'll still label the continents by which descendant, supposedly went in those places. After the flood, we get something that's sometimes called the Table of Nations. So the genealogy of Noah and his sons is spelled out in relationship to all these nationalities, a whole bunch of which, we don't know, we don't care about. This is not exhaustive. It's something that's important. I really try to highlight some of the biggest or the most important people. But Genesis 10 is a really important chapter if you want to dive in more to the actual Bible and where we see this. But basically, all of this is spelled out in written form in Genesis 10 and a few other places. So, Japheth, eldest son of Noah. Again, as I mentioned, sort of generally thought of as having settled Europe. Through his first son, Gomer, he had Ashkenaz, whose Ashkenaz is associated with Assyria, but there's a big question mark here, because you might also be familiar with Ashkenazi Jews. And so we think the Ashkenazis originally were sort of this group in modern-day Turkey. It's why they became associated with the Assyrians. And then later, this idea, I'm not even really sure. I tried to do some research of why this name was claimed. But I think it mostly comes from Japheth, who sought to settle Europe. So these European Jews sort of claimed this name, though that is millennia later. So no direct connection. A second son, Magog, was associated with the ancient kingdom of Magog. We don't know really much about that. Interestingly enough, Magog is used as an idiom in places like Daniel and Revelation to kind of mean the ends of the world. So Magog might refer to the ancient Scythia, sort of northern Caucasus, or even, honestly, modern-day Ukraine, interestingly enough. That's where Magog is. All right, Shem now, second son of Noah. One son, Aram, is associated with the Aramites. That's really nice. We'll see a lot of those names and the names of the people that are associated with, closely connected. Aram had one son, Uz. Uz is associated with the land of Uz, and the land of Uz is considered synonymous with the land of the Amorites. The Amorites, yes. And interestingly enough, you may know that Job is from the land of Uz. And it's something you may miss when you pick up the book of Job, but Job, arguably, is a Gentile. He believes in the God I am and serves God and is righteous before God, but he is not of the covenant people in Israel, which is sort of interesting. An important descendant is Erphaxad. I can't pronounce that one. Mostly because Terah, father of Abraham, this is where Abraham descends. So we'll pick up with Terah in just a bit. You need to know that it's through Shem that Israel and Jacob and Abraham and that whole family descends from. But the third son of Noah is actually pretty important for us today, Ham, which again is also, we sort of think of, he settled Africa. Ham's four sons. First there was Cush, associated with the Cushites. Cush is a land just talked about in the Bible a lot as being wealthy, rich with gold and gems and things like that.
Well, that's where Cushy came from.
Cushy came. Oh!
I'm just guessing.
Oh.
You have a Cushy life.
A Cushy life. That could be an interesting connection. Cush had three descendants of note: Seba, Rama, and Sheba. Sheba, of course, you can think of as Sheba, the queen of Sheba. These were all sort of south of Egypt, or maybe south on the Arabian Peninsula. Then there's another son of Ham is Mizraim. And sometimes you'll pick up the Bible and he is just called Egypt because the word Egypt in Hebrew is Mizraim. They're one and the same. And so whether you see his name Mizraim, which is the Hebrew transliteration, or if it's translated Egypt, of course you can imagine, he's thought of as the father of the Egyptians. He had one son of note, Kaltorum, and Kaltorum is said to be the father of the Philistines. And we know historically there's a close connection between the Philistines and the Egyptians. Goliath, for example, is a Philistine in the story of God's people. Another son of Ham, Put, associated with Libya, sort of, again, the farthest western sort of region that these people would have known in those times. But most importantly is the son Canaan, right? Canaan is the father of the Canaanites, and they, of course, are the ones who are sort of one of the main people that God's people are pitted against as they settle into the land. Now, Canaan had several sons himself who become associated with different tribes of the Canaanites. So, one son is Sidon. There's no nation of Sidon, but Sidon is a city in Phoenicia. Phoenicians, of course, were associated with things like purple dye. This northern region also associated with things like cedar trees, cedars of Lebanon, for example, cypress trees, so other sort of riches from outside of Israel. There's the son Heth. Heth is associated with the Hittites. And then we get a group of sons that are actually named for the people, right? So there's Jebusite, who's associated with the Jebusites. There's Amorite, who's associated with the Amorites. There's Girgashite, who's associated with the Girgashites. There's Hivite, who's associated with the Hivites. But the Hivites might be Hittites. We don't know. Again, God's people were writing this story down centuries, if not a millennia, after these things were occurring. They may have gotten some of the details mixed up. In addition, some of the listing of the Canaan tribes, there's a missing tribe here. We'll see that a little bit later. Jebusites were thought of to be the original settlers of Jerusalem. And as I mentioned, the Hivites were probably associated with the Hittites. So there's a lot of confusion about the Hittites. Who do they represent on this tree? We don't precisely know. Heth seems to be the most logical thing, but Hivite seems to be a confusion. The Girgashites were displaced at some time. We think that they were originally from Anatolia, sort of eastern Turkey, and something displaced them, and they migrated south. And that's something that we'll see throughout this story, is a lot of people were displaced, they moved around, they were nomadic. So a lot of these borders, when we get to the maps, the borders are very, very loose, as things change. Now I mentioned the flood creates a great sort of cutting off point. The next most important sort of branch of this family tree is from Terah. So here's Terah, descended from Araphax after 7 or 8 generations, depending on how you count. And Terah is, of course, the father of Abraham, but he's also the father of Haran. And because he's the father of Haran, he's the grandfather of Lot. And Lot's important because Lot's 2 sons get their own nations too. So, Haran's son Lot, and this is tough. You read a story about Lot, right? He flees from Sodom when it's being destroyed. And his wife, turns back and looks, and she turns to a pillar of salt. So it's just him and his 2 daughters. And the daughters think that the whole world's been destroyed, not just Sodom and Gomorrah. They think the whole world's been destroyed. So they're thinking, if we're going to have children, if we're going to produce, keep on, humanity going, we're going to have to sleep with our father. And this is where I pointed out that maybe the Moabites would not claim this heritage for themselves, but Moab and the Ammonites are thought of as descendants of Lot through the process of incest. And that carries a sort of a stigma with God's people for a long time. Moabites and Ammonites were one of the 2 groups that it was absolutely forbidden for intermarriage, even under the Mosaic law, partially because of that. We'll see that it wasn't actually observed that strictly a little bit later on. So a little discomfort here, but God's people said that the Moabites and the Ammonites were descended from Lot, and that's where the nation came from. Of course, we might be familiar, Ruth is a Moabite. Right? We'll talk a little bit more about her later on. Then Ben-Ami is his Ami Ammonites, but he's one that sort of breaks the pattern of I'm Cush and my people are the Cushites, Interestingly, the Ammonites, they attacked Israel as they were wandering through the wilderness. It's kind of why they got such a bad rap a little bit later on. And you might remember the story about Moses lifting up his hands for the battle, and when he did that, they were winning, and then when he did get tired, then they would start losing, so they had to hold his hands up so they went to battle. That was against the Ammonites in the wilderness. So some of these grudges are held, all the way back before they had even settled in the land, Now, perhaps more significant, of course, as we're familiar, is it's Abraham's branch to this family tree that has, look at all of these additional descendants from Abraham that we're going to talk about. Abraham had 3 partners, 3 wives, and from each a child and descendants therefrom. Interestingly enough, the first child that was born to the second wife, not to the first. Of course, we remember Ishmael was born to Hagar before Isaac was to Sarah. Ishmael is, of course, associated with the Ishmaelites. The Ishmaelites were the ones who bought Joseph from his brothers and then took him to Egypt as a slave. Ishmael had one son, Kedar. Kedar associated with the Kedarites. And you'll hear the Kedarites, they come up in the Psalms a lot, and they'll talk about the tents of Kedar. They were also associated, they were good warriors, and they were particularly known as good bowmen in war. Second son is born to Abraham's first wife, Sarah. This, of course, is Isaac. This is the child that all the hopes and dreams are pinned on, right? And of course, Isaac is favored over Ishmael, who is sent away with Hagar and sort of dispossessed by Abraham. God turns around and claims Ishmael and gives him a great nation, just as to Isaac. The third son, and it's easy to overlook, but Abraham had a third wife, Keturah, and Keturah had a child, Midian, associated with the Midianites, right? Midian, specifically the Midianites, Jethro is a Midianite. Moses married Zipporah, who was a Midianite. So there is this this interweaving back in of this story. You know, once you learn some of this stuff, you pick up on it as you read the Bible along the way. When you just read about Moses fleeing to Midian and getting married to Midian, you know, it just might pass over you what's really going on here. Now, as I mentioned, it's Isaac through whom God's people descended. 2 important sons of Isaac, twins, as I mentioned earlier. Esau is the firstborn twin, associated with the Edomites. He, of course, sold his birthright to his brother Jacob, or, depending on which story you read, tricked out of his birthright by Jacob. And Esau, the actual word Esau, Edomites, comes from the Hebrew root for the word red or ruddy. It's sort of thought, Edom is thought of the red land because there's a lot of red sand or clay in that region. And you can read that Esau is sort of described as being ruddy for that reason. So Esau has a son, Eliphaz. Eliphaz has a son, Amalek. Amalek associated with the Amalekites. So we have another sort of branch. I have to say, the Amalekites, the Ammonites, the Amorites, why do they have to be those 3 that sound so similar? It's frustrating. I had to keep them. You should see the notes I took to prepare for this. Had to really, really sketch it all out. Jacob is the second-born twin. He, of course, is renamed by God Israel. Really important name change because Jacob basically means scoundrel in Hebrew, which is an awful name to give a child, I might say. And then God renames him Israel, one who strives with God. And the implication is one who strives with God and prevails, right? So Jacob wrestles with God. He's given a new name. Pretty significant there. Jacob had 4 partners. I'm trying to distinguish it. I think the Bible uses the word wife, not concubine. Maids is the word we get in the reading today. And so I'm trying to be careful with my language. But we've got Leah, we've got Rachel, we've got Bildah, and we've got Zilpah, right? And a whole bunch of kids from these 4 wives. By Leah, we've got Reuben and Simeon and Levi and Judah and Issachar and Zebulun and Dinah. Dinah should be a circle. Dinah, of course, is a female. That's my mistake. From Rachel, Jacob's preferred wife, favoritism a little much in this family. Jacob's favorite wife, Rachel, has Joseph. In the reading today, Benjamin is not yet born, of course. That happens later. If you were here on Wednesday, you heard all about Joseph and Benjamin and all of that. Joseph has two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Bildah, Dan, and Naphtali. From Zilpah, Gad, and Asher. And what you see here is I put if it's got a square's got a purple in it, it's because there's a people, a nation that is descended from that person, according to the Bible. The orange colorations are for tribes of Israel. So there's a little distinction there for you. So what's interesting is you'll notice that Joseph's not a tribe, not really. It's a little awkward how it's referred to in the Bible, because what ends up happening is Joseph's two sons are both given tribes, and it's also reversed. Isn't Ephraim the eldest, I think? So,
well, but they are also blessed by Jacob.
yes.
Right? So
So the mixing of the spices, right? The explanation's a little tricky. The explanation is because Jacob blesses them and elevates them and puts them on the same level as, his sons. And what happens is, and later it says the tribe of Joseph was sort of upset. They weren't given an allotment, but it's like the tribe was divided into two new tribes, and they got led. I did not parse that out fully, so take everything I'm saying on that front with a grain of salt. Now, genealogy accounts for a lot of these people that we interact with or see, in the Bible, but not everything is counted in the genealogies. So let's turn to geography. Now, if you pick up one of those modern Bibles, it's really nice. You can flip to the page with the maps, right? But there were no maps drawn by the original authors. They're all recreations. One of the real challenges is that in the Bible, there are these descriptions of lands that the people occupy, and they're all referential. So it's like to the River Dan or to the Wadi of Egypt, and you're like, it's all referential, so it's hard to be like absolutely sure where these boundaries were. More importantly, the concept of a hard boundary for a lot of these people was a foreign concept. That is a product of modern nation building. So a lot of these lands, they wouldn't have drawn a hard boundary in the first place. So it's a little odd for us to do it, but it fits really well with our monkey brains that want nice definitive things.
What brains?
Our monkey brains. The context is often tribal and nomadic, which means that, again, the concept of hard boundaries means nothing to these people. It was, we're here in this season, and then we're here in another season. Moreover, who controls the land changes over time. One of the hard things is like the Ammonites got defeated by the Amorites at some point. So what used to be their land is now and it's really hard to keep track. So any map that we're looking at, it's like maybe just a snapshot in time, and it doesn't reflect the whole story. All of which is to say that modern maps are approximations and shouldn't be thought of as authoritative. The Bible is more authoritative than any map that somebody has drawn from the stories in the Bible. And so one of the things, I put this up here, because you see Ramah and Sheba here, and Seba here, and we'll see on another map, these are some of the most, we're not entirely sure where some of these are. Sometimes they're placed south of Cush, sometimes they're placed here in like modern day Yemen, sometimes they're all the way over here. So we're not exactly sure, because it's referential, and it's kind of, they're from the south, and that kind of could mean here south or here south in a lot of ways. So even look at this Sheba, Ramah, Seba. Look at this map. They're kind of in different places. Seba is here, but Seba is also here. Havilah is here instead of over here. Cush is now south, So we can't. Just like every map that you ever see, no, it's an approximation. It's not authoritative, okay? Something really, really important.
Well, and ask mile off their coast are Greek, and they
Right.
will defy you.
Yeah. Well, it's just like draw any map, and you know, like any land has been claimed by these people and those people, and has been fought over. You know, so it's difficult, right, to draw those boundaries. So geography now. Let's see here. Okay, Magog. You see it way up there, up in the northern Caucasus. End of the known world, right? So really, really far away to God's people. Modern day Ukraine, probably. Assyria. Here are the Ashkenaz, kind of up here in Assyria, and in fact, I think this purple line might show the extent of the Assyrian Empire at its height. Aram, Uz, kind of odd. Let's see here. Yeah, Aram. Yeah, here's Aram, sort of off to the northeast of Israel. I mentioned Cush, south of Egypt here. All that gold and treasures and stuff. Cushy place. Might as be associated with modern day Ethiopia or Sudan. As I mentioned, Sheba, Ramah, Sheba are all similarly located, but it's difficult to precisely place. We think that some of these were provinces of the Egyptian Empire when they were at the biggest, and one of the reasons why we have them on Havilah on both sides is we think they had a navy that controlled the Red Sea, so they had these provinces that were on either side, much like the Greeks colonized on the other side of the is that the Aegean Sea? Yeah. Mizraim, son of Ham, simply called Egypt. I think we all know where Egypt is. Kaltorum is associated with the Philistines. They would have been, you see it here on Crete here. I've seen another map on here. Philistines, they settled along the coast. Phoenicians settled along the coast as well. But the Philistines associated with Egypt settled a little bit closer to Egypt. They might have at one time been a client kingdom to help keep the highway along the sea open for the Egyptian imperial forces.
And somewhere along the way, as I've tried to look at whether Philistine and Palestinian are related, they are.
Okay.
But, again, it's this loose,
yeah,
but they're in the land,
yeah,
in that same land.
Especially during the end of the Bronze Age, which is kind of this period that we're talking about, that there was mass migrations across the entire world at the time. There were ecological things going on in the world that were causing people to be displaced. And so it is hard to know where all the people came from and where they settled to and who they became part of and who we know them to be today. Land of Cana, we're probably pretty familiar with that, sort of the west side of the Jordans where the Canaanites lived. Let's see here. Really hard to see here. I think it's on here. Yeah, Zidon, this one with the Z, up here with the Phoenicians. On this map, I think Zidon is right about here. So associated again with the Phoenicians. Half associated with the Hittites, sort of, let's see here, Hittites, are they on this map? There's so kind of up here in this region. Turkey. A lot of people in Turkey. I mentioned the Jebusites were associated with Jerusalem, kind of right about here.
So not that we can reenact the whole thing, but it was at the Jabbok that Jacob crossed and came into...
Yeah.
So he must have gone, did he go south around
I'm
there?
assuming that he crossed south because Edom is down here, and it says that Esau was coming from Edom. Mm-hmm. So that's my assumption.
And then north into the land.
I mentioned that the Girgashites, not a lot's known about them. They probably were transplants from Anatolia settled in Cana. Hivites, maybe Hittites. There is one missing Canaanite tribe that's not among Canaan's sons, and that's the Perizzites. I know, it's awful, isn't it? The term in Hebrew sounds an awful lot like what we might call rural people. It may have been originally a term to refer to anybody that wasn't settled in a city or a township, but then perhaps became associated with a specific type of people in the land. They probably lived in the hill country in Cana and Samaria, but not accounted in the genealogies, interestingly enough. Now when we jump down to Terah, we have the descendants of Lot and the descendants of Abraham. Two sons of Lot, Moab and Ben Ami, so Moabites, here we have. And then, I want to make sure I get this right. The Ammonites, you can also see, kind of settled all sorts of places. Over here, Ammonites over east of the Jordan River. Now the Ishmaelites were wandering traders. They didn't really settle in a land. And you can think of, having sold Jacob into slavery into Egypt, makes sense. The Ishmaelites probably lived kind of here in northern Arabia, and they would have gone back and forth, probably from Egypt to other places. So again, it makes sense. Oh, look, there's those Ishmaelites. They'll take our Saudi brother off our hands. And understandable why he ends up in Egypt, right? Because the Ishmaelites would have traded with them.
So it's interesting, though, that there are actually two references to one to Ishmaelites and one to Midianites when they sell Joseph.
There is, yeah.
One, I can't remember which one comes first, but they both are attributed with the possibility of selling somebody into slavery.
Yes. And of course, the Midianites kind of down here in Sinai, so another people that would have, this is wasteland, this is deep desert, so people who would have gotten through. They certainly were one of them. Esau and Edomites, mentioned down here, down south. Amalekites, sort of south of Israel as well. Jacob and Israel, now Israel, right? And he and his descendants sort of settled that central Levant area, mostly Canaan, but not just Canaan, lands both sides of the Jordan. Now the Israelite tribes, not nations, but these are the tribes here, and they were each sort of given allotments. So you can see Reuben there, east of the Dead Sea, Simeon way down in the deep south. Judah also had territory in the south. Issachar had a very small region in the north, west of the Jordan River. Zebulun also had a small territory, pretty much just right in the Jezreel Valley. Joseph, of course, his people were divided into two. Manasseh has a huge territory on both sides of the Jordan, but kind of separated by Gad, who had the sort of the central Jordan Valley, at least on the eastern side. So again, tribal lands. We really shouldn't think of them as solid, firm, definitive. They would have been able to cross over, no problem. Ephraim, also sort of south, located just initially sort of around the initial, close to Jerusalem. Benjamin had a very small territory, sort of centrally located, also really close to Jerusalem. Dan was along the west coast. Naphtali, far north, around the Sea of Galilee, to the west. Gad was in Gilead, east of the Jordan. And Asher had a territory sort of northwest along the coast. Now there's a tribe missing here. Anybody know which of the tribes didn't get a land allotment for a specific reason? Levi, right. Why didn't Levi's descendants get an allotment of land? Because they're the Levites, they're the priests. They have different sort of endeavors to be involved with. They're involved with the worship of God, not necessarily with agricultural and economic pursuits. But God, interestingly enough, appointed, I think it was 48 cities to be under sort of to have the Levites in those cities, to do the kinds of things, to remember God and to celebrate, to honor God. And interestingly enough, 6 of those cities were the cities of refuge, the cities where people could flee if they had unintentionally killed someone. And
Is that that's in the Pentateuch?
yes, it's in, Deuteronomy appoints, says when you get to the land, Moses says, God will show you these cities to establish the cities of refuge. And then Joshua does it when during the allotment of the land, says, all right, these cities will be given for cities of refuge. So geographically, there's a lot of land that overlaps. Clearly, God's people must have, like if you look at this map, and you look at this map, you know God's people must have lived in, with, and among Gentiles. And yet they were also viewed as part of God's family tree. They were, even if they weren't necessarily part of God's covenantal way, that is, Israel. So the final area that we need to look at today is relationship. What kind of relationship did God's people have with these Gentile neighbors? What was the relationship God wanted them to have? And then maybe what is Jesus' commentary on what that is? There are really, what we eventually see are 2 different perspectives that emerge. And I like to think of them as that one's a hardline perspective, one is a more inclusive perspective. The hardline perspective is the one that we're perhaps most familiar with, because it's kind of, when we tell the story, right, God's people came to land, and then they conquered him, and they kicked out all the Gentiles, like that's kind of the mental picture that we tell. And if you read the book of Joshua, that's totally what Joshua wants you to think. But you read other books in the Bible, you see that it wasn't so neat and cut and dry. The more inclusive perspective suggests that God's people did live among their Gentile neighbors with covenantal relationship expected by God. And I'll show you some of this. But we have to remember, we are getting a final product. The spices have already been mixed, as Pastor Lori said, and we can't go through and perfectly pick each of the ingredients out from here. But we can see threads where more Gentile inclusion among God's people was present, and other examples of more restrictive relationships. So we're going to look at some examples of both. Some of the examples are going to be hard, because they're harsh, they're difficult. Maybe they cause us to grieve a little bit. They're hard to place inside our theological framework, but it's helpful to read the Bible and let us acknowledge, what's there. These examples also aren't going to always agree with each other. I like to say the Bible's not a book, it's a library, and the authors are in conversation with each other. They don't always agree. So let's look at these relationships. Let's look at them through that question of what relationships did God want God's people to have? What were the relationships really like? And what does Jesus say? So first, against Gentile inclusion is the book of Leviticus. And Leviticus has this sort of idea, this sort of concept. They envision what's going to happen when God's people settle there. And they imagine that the land itself has a degree of agency, like a human body, right? So what happens when you eat spoiled food? Your body rejects it, and you throw it up. So, very visceral here. Leviticus uses the concept of spewing out or vomiting out. The land has agency, and not because they're Gentiles, not because they're not God's people, but because they don't follow the law. That the land itself will reject the people, that they will be vomited out. And so now that these other people have been removed, then God's people can come in and settle. So against Gentile inclusion is this concept of they're not of the covenantal way, so the land itself will reject them. That's sort of a perspective from Leviticus. Deuteronomy is mostly in the inclusive camp, but there's at least one section that seems to suggest that Deuteronomy is against Gentile inclusion, which is this command from Moses that in the conquest they really are meant to fully conquer the people. They're not to intermarry with them or have any kind of business relationship. Moses says, don't even make a covenant with these people. You are to be separate and apart. So Deuteronomy has at least one passage that seems to be against Gentile inclusion. We'll see much later. Deuteronomy's overall perspective is quite inclusive of Gentiles. Joshua is perhaps the hardest. Joshua has this concept in it of, it's called the ban, and it says that there's a blanket ban on all booty. You can't go to war because you want to loot. But the consequence of that is that everything is to be destroyed, including every person. And this is where you get the parts where you're like, the conquest was genocide. And as it's described by Joshua, it might fit into that category. Because the concept was men, women, children, slaves, animals, all of it was to be executed. And that's really, really harsh to utterly destroy. But the thing is, we get this picture from Joshua, but the other perspective is this didn't really happen. It's just the explanation for why things are the way they are. In the days in which the book of Joshua was written, all of these Canaanites were no longer in the land. And so there had to be an explanation. What happened to them? The conquest becomes an explanation for why it is the way that it is. And if you read Joshua, you'll read that he almost, not quite, but he almost conquers the entire land. He gives a little bit of saying, okay, well, I didn't finish this little part. You can do that after I've died. That's your inheritance. But really the picture you get from Joshua is that the entire land was conquered. All of the Gentiles were driven out, and people can sit around and sing Kumbaya, and it's all perfect. Then when you open up the first chapter of Judges, it goes, and because the land was not fully conquered, right? So the very next story acknowledges that Joshua paints a very rosy picture of the conquest. So it's important to remember Joshua presents things the way he wants them to be presented. Now, far more impressive and far more examples are of Gentile inclusion. They come from all over the place. Exodus, for example, in the same places where they say, keep the Sabbath day, the passages that say that say, and it's for your Gentile neighbor as well. It doesn't matter if you are of God's people or if you're, as the passage here says, an alien resident in your town, right? That Sabbath is for all. Gentiles are included in that.
That means that if you own the Fast Mart and it's the Sabbath, your employee gets the day off too.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. In Exodus and Deuteronomy are very focused on justice. And Exodus makes it clear that you're not supposed to have separate rules for your people and separate rules for Gentiles. Oppression against Gentiles is not allowed simply because they are Gentiles. Justice is for all under God's law. Which is pretty darn, I think it's cool. I love this passage from Numbers where it says Gentiles can be included in Passover celebrations, right? So invite your Gentile neighbor in. Even to this day, I think it's considered a blessing to have a Gentile come and visit you for Passover. So can maybe angle from an invite from your Jewish neighbor. Again, there's this concept of equality under God's law. And what's really interesting is that this isn't just the law, the covenantal law. This is a passage about justice in civil government as well. Again, that emphasization that Gentile and Jew are considered equal before God and under the ethical expectations under God's law and civil law. Deuteronomy has several passages. Again, justice for all, not just for Gentiles. There are 4 different really great passages that make it clear. You shall not deprive a resident alien or an orphan of justice. You shall not take a widow's garment in pledge. Right? It's just, I have given it to the Levites, to the resident aliens. the resident aliens are considered among the allotment. When God says, okay, the Levites don't have land, so you need to provide for them, the same passage in Deuteronomy speaks to the resident aliens who may have been deprived of their land too.
This is the testimony of the book of Ruth, when Naomi and Ruth come back into the land and they're starving and they need to have food, and Boaz gives them the opportunity to glean from the outer perimeter of the fields.
Yeah, that's right.
Because that's written into the law.
Exactly, yeah. It's all caught up together. Deuteronomy, when it lists out different lands and different peoples, there are Gentiles that are included. And I mentioned the descendants of Lot, both the Moab and the Ammonites are considered along the allotment. And God tells Moses, I don't want you to even fight with these people. If you can avoid battling with them, that would be great, because they are descendants of Lot. And in Judges, we see a lot of examples of God's people living within and among God's people. I pick these two passages because it makes it clear. Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants, right? So when Joshua says, and the land was cleared, right? The next book points out very clearly, no, that wasn't the actual case. So we see these two different threads. We have a sort of a strict relationship with Gentiles, which is more exclusive, and a more inclusive way. Some people imagine their relationship in very strict terms, focused on things like conquering, driving the Gentile people out, and prohibitions on on intermarriage and certain business relationships. Other people, however, imagine their relationship as being more inclusive, as they lived among God's people, as they lived among these Gentiles, and incorporated them into community living, worship, and providing equal protections under the law. So what was it really like, though, right? These are kind of rosy pictures, but what was it really, really like? And we do get the impression that there was this sort of tenuous relationship with the Gentile neighbor. Some people were more inclusive, some people weren't. But we see these really great examples of Gentile inclusion all over the Bible. There's lots of intermarriage, even when intermarriage is often banned. There are also sort of interesting moments. Bathsheba, the whole thing with David is she's caught because she's bathing on the roof, because it's not just a bath, it's a ritual bath. She's making mikvah after menstruating. So even though she is described as a Hittite, she's participating in the ritual life of the community. So there are also examples of Ruth intermarries twice, not just once, and she's also a convert, a Gentile convert. And people like the widow of Sidon and Naaman the Syrian are also healed by Elijah and Elisha, so they're all included. There are less examples, but there are also some concrete examples of Gentile exclusion. Ezra specifically blames the exile on intermarriage, and Nehemiah evicts a Gentile that had taken up residence in an apartment in the temple. He's like, no Gentiles in the temple. So kind of interesting. Jesus reacts against this stuff. What we see is that Jesus is both a radical and not a radical. Like, he taps into the older tradition that was more inclusive, but by Jesus' day, overwhelmingly, people were more about excluding the Gentile, excluding the Samaritan. So we see in his ministry a lot of attempts to sort of more deeply include Gentiles. For example, Jesus heals the servant of the centurion, a Roman soldier who was probably involved in the occupation of his own land, a Gentile who he heals. Jesus also refers to the fact that it was Naaman the Syrian who was healed, and the result was his hometown synagogue, they tried to get him killed over pointing out that Gentiles were part of God's grace and promises too. Jesus' family tree is full of Gentiles. Rahab is probably a Canaanite. Ruth, we know, is a Moabite. Bathsheba is described as a Hittite. These were just part. Matthew incorporates these Gentiles to make it a point that Jesus descends from the same family tree that we're talking about. Additionally, look at David. David had a Moabite great-grandmother and a Canaanite great-great-grandmother. right? So these really, really important things. Jesus inspired his first followers, his disciples, to also be deeply involved with Gentile inclusion. Paul, Barnabas, Silas, Peter, and Philip, they were all instrumental in the first generation of reaching out and doing ministry, not just with Jews in the scattered lands, but with Gentiles as well. So we consider this relationship with the other. We see that history may be hard to pick apart from the witness of the Bible. But it looks like a lot of Gentiles lived within and among God's people and were included in a variety of different ways, even if God's people understood themselves to be distinct from them. Later, as Gentiles were marginalized more and more, largely as a reaction to the exile, we have Jesus who comes on the scene and provides a little corrective action along the way. He and other prophets challenge this perspective and show us that Gentiles are part of God's family. So I hope you have enjoyed this presentation. Maybe you learned a little bit of something about really complicated tribal lands during this time, but really see that God's people envisioned them as part of God's family and able to participate in this way of life. So thanks so much for joining me today, and see you next week.